A routine traffic stop turns into a shocking lesson about respect, justice, and power, when a racist cop pulls over the wrong person and instantly regrets it. The night was calm, the streets quiet, and the city seemed to breathe slowly under the glow of the streetlights. It was one of those evenings when nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. The hum of engines and the faint sounds of crickets filled the air as cars moved steadily along the road. Among them was a sleek black sedan, polished so well that the reflections of passing lights glided across its surface like ripples on water. Inside the car sat a man dressed neatly, his face calm, his posture upright. He had driven down this road many times before, never expecting that tonight would unfold so differently. A police cruiser lurked near the corner of the block, its engine running low and its lights dimmed. Inside, an officer scanned the passing cars with a critical eye. He wasn't just watching for broken taillights or speeding vehicles. His gaze carried something heavier, a prejudice that shaped the way he saw the world. When the black sedan approached, the officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't see a man simply driving home. He saw a man whose skin color made him suspicious, someone he instantly believed did not belong behind the wheel of such an expensive car. His lips curled into a thin, satisfied smirk as he reached over and flicked the switch. The red and blue lights flashed to life, spilling across the quiet street in a sudden blaze of authority. The driver noticed the flashing lights in his mirror. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but his expression didn't change much. With a steady hand, he guided his car to the side of the road and parked smoothly, as though he had nothing in the world to hide. He switched on his hazard lights, rolled down his window and rested his hands on the steering wheel, calm, composed, and patient. He knew the rules of a traffic stop and he followed them carefully. The officer, however, approached with an attitude that betrayed his intentions. His footsteps were heavy, echoing on the pavement as though each one carried a sense of ownership of the street. His hand hovered near his holster, though there was no threat in sight. When he reached the window, he leaned down with a posture that wasn't meant to protect or serve, but to intimidate. Well, the officer sneered, his voice laced with sarcasm. Driving a car like this at this time of night, huh? What are you doing out here? His words were sharp, designed not to ask but to accuse. The driver met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Good evening, officer," he said politely. His tone carried no trace of anger, no hint of defensiveness. He spoke as one would to a stranger deserving of courtesy. "I'm on my way home." The officer chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slowly as though he had just heard a poor excuse. "Home, huh? You live around here?" His questions were not curious, they were mocking, dripping with disbelief. His eyes scanned the car's interior, searching for something, anything to justify the stop. "Yes," the driver replied, his voice calm as ever. "Just a few blocks away." He made no sudden movements, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. He had dealt with situations like this before, and he knew all too well how quickly things could escalate. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp. He didn't ask politely, he barked the order as though speaking to someone beneath him. The driver, maintaining his composure, reached slowly into his glove compartment, pulled out the documents and handed them over without a word. As the officer took them, he studied the driver once more, still clinging to the arrogant belief that he had caught someone who didn't belong. His smirk widened slightly, fueled by the false sense of power that came from the flashing lights, the uniform and the badge on his chest. Around them, a few cars drove past, their drivers glancing at the scene before continuing on. To them, it looked like just another traffic stop, but to the man in the driver's seat, it was the beginning of something far more telling. The air between the two men grew heavier by the second. The driver remained silent, his calmness almost unsettling in the face of such disrespect. The officer, though outwardly confident, was too blind to realize that his assumptions would soon collapse. In his eagerness to belittle, he had no idea that the man in front of him was not just another driver, not just another face he could push around. He was about to discover that this stop, meant to feed his arrogance, would instead bring him face to face with truth and accountability. The flashing lights continued to bathe the street in red and blue, but underneath their glow, a storm was quietly building, one that would turn the officer's smirk into regret before the night was over. The officer held the driver's license in his hand, squinting under the glow of his flashlight as if the letters on the card might reveal a hidden crime. His lips pressed into a thin line, and the arrogance in his posture did not fade. Instead of conducting a routine check, he let suspicion guide his every word. The driver remained calm, his hands resting steadily on the steering wheel, his patience unshaken despite the officer's obvious hostility. But silence only seemed to provoke the man in uniform further. "So," the officer said slowly, his tone heavy with sarcasm, "this your car?" He tilted his head toward the sleek sedan as though the very idea was laughable. His voice carried an edge as if daring the driver to justify himself. "You don't exactly look like the kind of guy who'd be driving something this expensive." The driver turned his head just slightly, his expression still composed. "Yes, officer," he replied in an even tone. "This is my car." His words were simple, calm and respectful, but the lack of defensiveness seemed to irritate the officer even more. The officer took a step closer, resting his hand on the edge of the window frame, his shadow stretching across the interior of the car. "You know," he continued, his voice dropping into something colder, "cars like this are usually stolen. You wouldn't happen to be involved in something shady, would you?" His eyes narrowed, studying every detail of the man's face, searching for guilt where there was none. "I can assure you, officer," the driver said firmly, though still without raising his voice, "this car is mine. I work hard for what I own." His words were measured, delivered with dignity, but he made no attempt to justify himself further. He knew that arguing with someone who refused to listen was a battle not worth fighting. The officer leaned back slightly, smirking as though he had just heard a clever joke. "Hard work, huh? That's a nice story." He tapped the license against the roof of the car. "Tell me what kind of hard work pays for something like this?" His words dripped with condescension, each syllable designed to belittle. The driver's jaw tightened for the first time, though his tone remained calm. "My profession allows me to live comfortably. That's all you need to know." His refusal to give in to disrespect, his steady composure, only deepened the uncomfortable tension between them. Around them, another car slowed as it passed, its driver glancing curiously at the scene before speeding off again. The flashing red and blue lights continued to bathe the street in an almost theatrical glow, drawing silent witnesses from behind curtains and windows. Yet the officer acted as though the world was his stage, his badge a shield for his arrogance. "You sound awfully confident," the officer said, circling slightly so he could peer inside the back seat of the sedan. "Most people don't act this calm when they're pulled over. Makes me wonder what you're hiding." He rapped his knuckles against the roof of the car, a small gesture meant to intimidate. The driver inhaled deeply, steadying his breath. "I have nothing to hide," he answered simply. His voice was neither sharp nor submissive. It was the voice of a man who understood his rights but chose patience over anger. The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "You people are all the same. Always think you can talk your way out of things." His words were harsher now, his prejudice no longer thinly veiled. He waved the license mockingly in front of the driver's face before pulling it back. "Maybe I should run this and see what comes up. Something tells me this won't come back clean." The driver met his eyes, his calm gaze holding firm. "You do what you feel is necessary, officer," he said quietly. The weight of his words, spoken without fear, hung in the air. It was not defiance but quiet strength, the kind of strength that unsettled men who thrived on intimidation. For a moment the officer faltered. He wasn't used to his words bouncing off without effect. Most people squirmed, grew defensive, or stumbled over excuses. This man, however, remained steady, unbroken by the insults hurled at him. The officer's smirk flickered, though he quickly masked it by turning away. "Stay right there," he barked, though it was unnecessary. The driver had not moved an inch. With the license still in hand, the officer walked back toward his cruiser, his shoulders stiff, his pride bruised by the driver's unshaken composure. As he moved, the air between them seemed to thicken, filled with the echo of every disrespectful word that had been spoken. Inside the sedan, the driver exhaled slowly, his hands still resting on the wheel. He had been through moments like this before, moments where patience was not just a choice but a necessity. Yet something in his eyes hinted that this encounter would not end like the others. This night was different. This officer was about to learn a lesson that would cut deeper than his arrogance could ever imagine. The flashing lights continued to spin, but beneath their glow, the balance of power was beginning to shift. The officer believed he was in control, but the truth, still hidden in the driver's calm silence, was about to turn the night upside down. Back in the cruiser, the officer slid into his seat and slammed the door shut with more force than necessary. He tossed the driver's license onto the console, muttering under his breath as he switched on the computer. The screen glowed in the dim interior, casting shadows across his face as he typed in the man's information. His arrogance still clung to him, but there was a faint edge of unease beneath it, an unease he refused to acknowledge. He told himself he had the upper hand, that this was just another stop where his authority would go unchallenged. The database began to load. The officer leaned forward, drumming his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel. The seconds stretched out longer than they should have, and in the stillness of the night, his own doubts crept in. He glanced back at the sedan where the driver sat perfectly still, his hands on the wheel, his face calm and unbothered. The composure unsettled him. Most drivers fidgeted, looked nervous, or tried to explain themselves before being asked. But this man had offered nothing but politeness and silence, and somehow that was more intimidating than any excuse. Finally, the screen displayed the results. The officer's eyes scanned the information once, then froze. His smirk disappeared. His lips parted slightly but no words came out. He leaned closer, reading again, making sure he hadn't misread. The name on the license was unmistakable. The driver wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a random man in an expensive car. He was a sitting judge, one of the most respected in the city. The officer's throat went dry. A pulse of panic thudded through his chest as he stared at the screen. The title, Honorable Judge, glared back at him like a spotlight, erasing the confidence he had carried only moments ago. This was no ordinary stop. This was a man who knew the law better than he did, a man with the authority to question every action he had taken, and the power to hold him accountable. In one swift moment, the arrogance that had filled him drained away, leaving only dread. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. His fingers tapped nervously against the computer, but nothing could undo what had already been said, what had already been done. He replayed his words in his mind, every sarcastic question, every mocking insult, every disrespectful tone, and each memory felt heavier than the last. The realization sank deeper. He hadn't just insulted a stranger. He had insulted a judge, someone who commanded respect not only in the courtroom but throughout the entire community. Taking a deep breath, the officer picked up the license and stepped out of the cruiser. His footsteps, which had been heavy with arrogance before, now dragged with hesitation. He approached the sedan slowly, forcing a weak smile onto his face, though his nerves betrayed him. The driver's eyes followed him calmly, still steady, still unshaken. "Sir," the officer began, his voice noticeably softer than before. I ran your license." His words stumbled, awkward and uneven. He cleared his throat, trying to find his footing. It seems you're, well," he trailed off, unable to form the sentence. The driver tilted his head slightly, watching him with quiet patience. "Yes?" he asked, his tone polite, though there was a firmness beneath it. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "It seems you're Judge," he said the name slowly, as though speaking it out loud confirmed the weight of his mistake. The silence that followed was unbearable. The driver didn't respond immediately, and that silence pressed harder on the officer's chest than any words could. Finally, the judge nodded once, a calm acknowledgement. "That is correct." His voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who didn't need to raise it to be heard. The officer forced a shaky laugh, trying to smooth over the tension. "Well, that changes things, doesn't it?" He rubbed the back of his neck, his earlier confidence completely stripped away. "I didn't realize, I didn't mean any disrespect, Your Honor." The judge's eyes stayed on him, unwavering. "Didn't mean any disrespect?" he repeated softly. The calmness in his voice carried more weight than anger ever could. "Your words and your tone said otherwise, officer." The officer flinched, his face heating under the truth. For the first time that night he felt small. Smaller than the flashing lights, smaller than the quiet street, smaller than the man who sat in front of him with dignity untouched. He opened his mouth to speak, but no excuse could mask the truth of what had already been done. As the silence stretched on, the officer realized something he had never considered before. Power didn't come from the uniform or the badge or the flashing lights. True power came from respect, from knowledge, from the calm strength the judge displayed even in the face of insult. And that truth, heavy and undeniable, was only beginning to unfold. The night had shifted. What began as a routine stop twisted into a moment the officer would never forget. His regret was growing, but the lesson had only just begun. The air between the two men was thick with silence. The officer shifted uneasily on his feet, clutching the license in his hand as though it might save him from the weight of his own actions. Across the window, the judge remained still, his calm presence filling the space with a quiet authority that needed no introduction. The flashing red and blue lights continued to spin in the background, but it was no longer the officer's badge that commanded attention. It was the dignity of the man he had tried to belittle. "Officer," the judge began, his voice steady and deliberate, Do you know what your badge represents? His question was not shouted, not scolding, but delivered with the gravity of a teacher asking a student to think carefully before answering. The officer opened his mouth, fumbling for words. It represents the law, he stammered. It's about keeping order. The judge's eyes remained fixed on him, calm yet piercing. The law, yes. Order, yes. But more than that, it represents trust. When you wear that badge, the people who see it are supposed to feel safe. They are supposed to know that you will treat them with fairness, dignity, and respect. Do you think your behavior tonight reflected that responsibility? The officer dropped his gaze to the ground, his throat tightening. The arrogance that had fueled him earlier now seemed like a heavy chain dragging him down. No, sir, he admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. The judge leaned back slightly, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. You approached me with assumptions, with hostility and with prejudice, he continued, his words firm but never raised. You did not ask questions to learn, you asked them to accuse. You did not treat me as a citizen deserving respect. You treated me as a suspect without cause. That is not the duty of a law officer. Each word struck harder than any shout could. The officer felt them settle into his chest, heavy with truth. He wanted to explain himself, to apologize, but he knew excuses would only deepen the shame. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of the lesson unfolding in front of him. The judge went on, his tone almost fatherly yet unyielding. Let me tell you something about power. True power does not come from a weapon on your hip or the lights on your car. It does not come from a badge or a uniform. True power comes from restraint. It comes from fairness. It comes from treating people with respect, even when you believe they owe you none. That is what separates justice from injustice, and a protector from an oppressor. The officer swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He had never been spoken to this way, not with anger, but with undeniable wisdom that cut deeper than any reprimand from his superiors ever had. The judge paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then he added, I did not reveal who I am to embarrass you. I did not reveal it to make you afraid. I revealed it because tonight, you needed to be reminded of the weight you carry every time you step into that uniform. If you cannot see past the color of a man's skin, then you cannot serve the law because justice sees no color, it sees only truth. The officer's chest rose and fell quickly as he absorbed the words. Shame burned hot in his face, but beneath it was something else, an uncomfortable recognition, a stirring of conscience he had long ignored. For the first time in his career, he felt smaller than his badge, humbled in a way that left no room for excuses. I understand, Your Honor, the officer managed, his voice thick with regret. I was wrong. The judge studied him for a long moment, his calm gaze searching the man's face. Finally he nodded once, slowly. Understanding is only the first step, he said quietly. Change comes from what you do next. You cannot undo what you said tonight, but you can decide whether you will repeat it tomorrow. That is your choice. The words lingered in the cool night air, heavier than any punishment could have been. The officer stood frozen, the lesson etched into him more deeply than any reprimand, any fine, or any suspension could have done. The flashing lights suddenly seemed mocking as though they no longer belonged to him. Inside the car, the judge remained composed, his dignity unshaken despite the insults he had endured. He had chosen not to respond with anger or revenge, but with wisdom, a wisdom that exposed the officer's arrogance and transformed it into shame. And in that moment, the officer understood something he had never considered before. Respect could not be demanded through force. It had to be earned through character. The quiet street returned to its stillness, the night resuming its rhythm, but the officer knew nothing would ever feel the same again. The lesson had been delivered, and it was one he would carry for the rest of his life. The officer stood stiffly beside the sedan, the judge's words echoing in his mind. For once, the flashing lights felt like a spotlight exposing his flaws rather than a symbol of authority. His grip on the license was weak, his hand trembling slightly as though he could no longer carry the weight of it. 100 thoughts rushed through him. Shame, regret, anger at himself, and an uncomfortable recognition that the man in front of him had shown him more dignity than he had deserved. Slowly he extended the license back through the window. Here's your ID, Your Honor, he said quietly, his tone stripped of arrogance. His voice was lower now, almost humble. I want to apologize. The way I spoke to you tonight was wrong. It wasn't professional, it wasn't respectful, and it wasn't fair. I let my assumptions guide me, and I know that's not what this uniform is supposed to stand for. The judge accepted his license without a word, slipping it back into his wallet with calm precision. He did not rush to forgive or to comfort. He let the silence hang heavy, giving the officer space to feel the full weight of what he had admitted. It was not cruelty, it was teaching. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. An apology is only meaningful if it changes your actions, he said softly, his eyes never leaving the officers. Words fade, but choices remain. The real test will come when you stand before someone else you have judged before knowing. What you do then will decide if this moment meant anything. The officer nodded quickly, his throat tight. I understand, sir. I promise I'll remember this. I'll do better. I don't want to be the kind of officer who abuses his badge. His voice cracked slightly with the sincerity of his regret. The judge's gaze softened, though it remained firm. Then let tonight be your turning point, he said. Every man is given chances to correct his path. Few take them. Do not waste yours. The officer stepped back, his chest rising and falling as he tried to process the lesson he had been given. For years, he had thought power came from authority, from control, from being the loudest and most feared presence in a room. But tonight had stripped that illusion away. True authority, he now understood, was quiet, patient, and rooted in respect. Inside the sedan, the judge finally started the engine. The car purred to life, smooth and steady, just like the man who drove it. The officer watched, feeling as though he were watching not just a vehicle drive away but a chapter of his life closing behind him. Yet deep inside, he knew it was also the beginning of something new, a chance to become better than the man who had stood here earlier, mocking and arrogant. The judge rolled down his window one last time before pulling off. Officer, he called out, his voice carrying a quiet weight that lingered in the cool night air. The officer stepped closer, listening carefully. Remember this, respect is not given because of a uniform. Respect is earned through character. If you hold on to that truth, you will not only serve the law, you will honor it. The words struck deep, settling into the officer's heart with the permanence of stone. He nodded firmly. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice stronger now, though tinged with humility. The judge gave a final nod, then slowly drove away, the glow of the sedan's taillights fading into the distance until the street was once again quiet. The flashing lights from the cruiser continued to spin for a few moments longer before the officer finally reached inside to shut them off. The sudden darkness was heavy, but it carried with it a strange peace. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road, reflecting on the night that had just unfolded. The arrogance that had once filled him was gone, replaced by a lingering weight of responsibility. He knew the judge could have embarrassed him, reported him, or even ended his career. But instead he had chosen to teach. That choice, merciful and wise, was the kind of power the officer now aspired to carry. As he climbed back into his cruiser, the officer no longer felt like the same man who had stepped out of it earlier. He didn't know what challenges tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would never forget this night, and he would never again let prejudice guide his actions. For the rest of his career, he carried the memory of that quiet street, the calm voice of the judge, and the lesson that had reshaped him. Power was not in intimidation. It was in restraint. Justice was not in assumptions. It was in truth. And respect. It could never be demanded. It had to be earned. The officer took one last deep breath, started his engine, and drove away, leaving behind the man who had humbled him, but carrying forward the wisdom that would change him forever.